One of the most interesting things about the book of Habakkuk is that it happens in a time that is directly parallel to the time that we live in today. One of the things about the Bible, people think, oh, that's ancient times for ancient people, and it really has little or no relevance for me in my life today. But because of what we know about the duality of prophecy, we know that it can have an ancient fulfillment as well as a future fulfillment. And what we have come to see here in the book of Habakkuk is that the things that happened to the tribe of Judah back at that time are going to happen again, yet in the very near future. Habakkuk was, concerned with the people of Judah and what they were doing. And God says, okay, there's going to be an impending punishment and captivity, and it's going to happen by the Babylonians. And then we skip all the way ahead to the very end of the Bible, and you get to the end of Revelation, and you see that the Babylonian system is going to be set up again. And before that, or even during that, that the people of Israel, and that includes Judah, will go into captivity again. And so we come to chapter 3, after Habakkuk poses the questions that he does in chapter 1 and 2, and God answers them, that he comes to a conclusion, he comes to a better place. And again, it's by faith that we talked about in chapter 2, that he offers up this kind of this prayer slash poem slash psalm. And in fact, it's even looks like it's 3 different ones here, based on his understanding and the conclusions that he has come to after this tete-a-tete, as it were, with God. And that's the way we pick up chapter 3 and verse 1. It's a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. Okay, now, this word, we don't want to get too hung up on Shigionoth, but the best that we perhaps can understand, and I don't want to get into it because whenever we start getting into speculation, especially for me personally, if it could be 1 or 2 or 3 different things, I can't really put that in my mind and have a place to hang my hat on, as it were. But let's suffice it to say that this word more than likely refers to a poetic style, right? Back in Psalm 7, again, in the New King James Version, which is what we read out of most often, it has this same word, right? I think it might be singular and it's plural here, but it says a meditation of David. And then in the Old King James, or the Authorized Version, it says a Shiggaion of David. And so, again, we look at these things and it may refer to, like I said, the style, but even, how it's supposed to be either sung or said or what have you. But nonetheless, what we see is what's called a theophany, and it's considered to be one of the more beautiful theophanies in the whole Bible. And theophany is a fancy word, and this may be the only time that you ever hear it, that means the appearance of God. And so we're going through chapter 3, and Habakkuk is talking about this to a very large degree, the appearance of God, and he calls upon past imagery as well as in future, and also having to do with the present in terms of what God is doing and how he is working out salvation for the people of Judah, even though they have to go through all that they go through. And so as we go through this, we'll see, I think in verse 3, 9, and 13, we'll see the word Selah, and I think that may offset these different quote-unquote psalms that we're going to go through. So continuing on in verse 2, it says, O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So he says, okay, I've heard your speech. And what we see is this transformation from the first chapter, right, in beginning up in verse 2, where he's airing his complaints. And Habakkuk has a different state of mind. And so he's going through this transformation, as we see. He learns of the details of God's judgment that's going to come down on his people, the people of Judah, and that they're about to go into captivity with the Babylonians are the Chaldeans. But not only their punishment, but the punishment that's going to come on the Chaldeans as well. And what he sees, he begins to understand these things, and he goes all the way to the point now, okay, and we're looking again at this change of mind and heart that he's having, that even here in verse 2 at the end of it, he says, in wrath, remember mercy, right? So he knows that the time that Judah is going to spend in Babylonian captivity is going to be somewhat short. I mean, relatively speaking, it's going to be 70 years. But, so he knows that that's going to end. And so the reference here could very well be, and most likely looks like it is, towards even the Chaldeans. So Habakkuk even says, okay, look, in your wrath on them that's going to come, when you punish them for them going above and beyond what they were supposed to do to Judah, that you even be merciful to him. So he's even reaching out to God, as it were, pleading on behalf of the Chaldeans, who are going to be the aggressors, who are going to be their captors. So again, whenever we look at what Habakkuk changed, or how he changed, then we see God working in him and God bringing about this change of heart, even for Habakkuk. So then Habakkuk begins to review, as it were, some of God's awesome works of the past. And this Theophany that we're talking about, his appearance in great power and might, and the judgments that he's going to execute, and he's going to save his people and even destroy the enemy. And so he goes through and he starts recalling all of these things throughout this Theophany, these prayers, poems, and psalms. Verse 3, it says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of praise. So Mount Paran there is the mountain ranges in the south of Israel, where Mount Sinai is located. And one of the better references to go along with this is Deuteronomy 33 and verse 2. In Deuteronomy 33 and verse 2, and I can read it for you since it's one verse, it says, and he said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints, or holy ones. And from his right hand came a fiery law for them. So again, it looks like what Habakkuk is trying to recollect here, or bring to the memory of the people, is what happened there at that time with the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And it talks about how his glory, speaking of God's glory, covered the heavens. Exodus 24 and verse 10, he says, they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and it was like the very heavens in its clarity. So again, he's bringing these things, and these are the stories that the Israelites were told, and it was passed on from generation to generation, very often in an oral manner. And so whenever he says these things, it immediately draws on those past stories. And again, I don't say stories in a light manner. I mean, it was the truth. It's the way it was passed on. It was their heritage. It was the way that they were taught, and they were told about God, and this is what he did. And so, when he says these things, right, that, okay, it happened here at Mount Paran, and that his glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise, that, okay, they're immediately transported back to those times, or if they weren't around at those times, then the stories that were passed on from generation to generation. So continuing there in Habakkuk, verses 4 and 5, it says, his brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. So once again, we have more imagery from the Exodus and the saving power that God showed. Right? So whenever the Israelites were in Egypt and they were slaves, they were virtually powerless in terms of being able to save them own selves. It was by the power and might of God and the plagues that he sent upon the people of Egypt, that they were saved. It was nothing by their own might or power. They had to do relatively little to get out. And part of that was to, put the blood on the doorpost, and then they had to walk out. And even God helped them with the walking along the way, because it wasn't, just the strong and young that were leaving. There were the old and there were the children as well, the babies, the toddlers, and what have you. So again, when this was brought to memory and all that he was doing, again, they're going, okay, yeah, God did this and now he did that. And then verse 6, he stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. So here he is. He measured, and the terminology there means judged, right? And it's talking about the mountains and the hills, which are often a symbolism for governments and peoples and nations. And so here it is. God's doing this. Okay, he's judging them, the peoples, nations, and they saw this along the way, how God fought their battles for them and made the way, as they, again, allowed God towards the promised land. And he's saying here, God, his ways are everlasting. He is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow, forever. So this same God that did those things is still inclined to do these things, especially since he's saying once again, reiterating it here in the book of Habakkuk, that he's going to do it yet once again. Obviously, they still had to go through their punishment. Okay, and again, it was a correction to get their attention. It's not because he's this maleficent type of God that's going to just, because of his capricious ways, bring down plagues and fires and whatnot on the people. It's to teach them, as a parent teaches the child. Sometimes it's just a way to get attention when they become so recalcitrant in their ways. So, yeah, God's going to be the same, even in that way, in that fashion. So continuing in verse 7, he goes, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. So, okay, we have these tents, these curtains, these temporary dwellings. Again, it was pictured, that kind of, to me, immediately in my mind, you kind of pictured the Feast of Booths and the Exodus. If you want to look at the end of, or towards the end of Exodus 23, verses 41 through 43, where all the holy days and feast days are mentioned, it tells about why, or part of it, that there was to be brought to memory at that time and why they were to dwell in booths when they had left the land of Israel. So they left, they're camping in the wilderness. Again, it was for 40 years, and they didn't have to do that, but because of their ways, they did, and God was teaching them lessons through there before they got to the promised land. And so they really didn't have a place to stay and to call home, and they were dwelling, quote unquote, on tents. And so Leviticus 23 and verse 41, it says, you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Okay, talking about the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, as it's also known. He says, you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations, why? May know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So part of that lesson, and it's a lesson even for us today, it was the temporary nature of the dwelling on the way to a more permanent one. So all the dwellings on earth are temporary. So even the tents and even where they were heading, but it foreshadowed a time in the future when the kingdom of God was going to be here, when it would be everlasting. So that's what it was. That's what was promised. That's what the promised land symbolized, was that permanence, and when it will turn to, in the future, be everlasting. So again, he's putting all of these words into their mind, and they're seeing these things, and it's kind of coming together. And perhaps we're going a little bit further than what they realized, but again, they knew it was temporary, just like the tabernacle in the wilderness was temporary, until they made the more permanent temple. And so here they are, they're having to dwell in these tents in their exodus out, in their journey towards the promised land. And we have the area of Cushan, or Cush was Ethiopia, so we're talking down the western edge of the Red Sea, okay, which is more or less where their journey began. And then it talks about Midian there as well. And I might reference 1 Kings 11, 17, and 18, which gives, again, a little bit more of the history and understanding. I know we can read through these things and you can just miss some of this stuff unless you start looking into it and studying it. But in 1 Kings 11, verses 17 and 18, it says, kind of breaking into the thought just a little bit, that Hadad fled to go to Egypt, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him to Hadad was still a little child. Then they arose from Midian and came to Paran, right, which we were talking about just before. And they took men with them from Paran and came to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave them a house, apportioned food for him, and gave him land. So what we see here, and when you go through the history of their wanderings, that the people of Midian were the last people that were to be conquered or overcome before the Israelites entered the promised land. So they were being avenged for leading the Israelites astray. Okay, this is what had happened in the past with the Midianites. And what we have then here is also, I think, there's a lesson, I should say, for us as well today, because we're going to see something kind of similar that's going to happen in the future when there's a second Exodus. So we have the first Exodus, they go through, they're led astray, they have to go through this test of overcoming these people, overcoming the trial that was set before them before they got into the promised land. And for the most part, I'll let you fill in all of those analogies, but there's going to be a second Exodus in the future, okay? And it's going to happen before some get to go into the promised land, which is the millennium is a type of, and even before some get to go into the ultimate promised land. And these things are going to be happening at nearly the same time, within a short period of time from each other. And of course, I mean by the ultimate promised land is into the kingdom of God as spirit beings, everlasting. So again, we see how this has information for us today, as well as for them back then, and for those who are going to be physical here in the near future. And I thought, again, so it's all quite interesting when you start looking at these things, because it doesn't immediately necessarily bring these things to mind. But again, had you gone through and heard the stories and were entering into the promised land, and you knew that you had this one last hurdle to overcome, it would have so much more meaning. And again, by studying and looking to these things, the Bible becomes even more alive. So back to Habakkuk chapter 3 and verse 8, it says, O Lord, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation? So to me, this looks like it's definitely, because we're still got the Exodus in mind here, that it's talking about the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, as well as the Jordan River, right? Which was also parted, right before they went into the promised land. And so, again, we keep that in mind as we're going through this. Okay, I was just looking, I think I'm going to address the horses just a little bit later, but super interesting about, we'll talk about what this refers to here later down in verse 15. But continuing on in verse 9, it says, your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. Selah. You divided the earth with rivers. This to me looks like it symbolizes, again, when we're just kind of taking it in context and going through the Israelites and how God manifested himself in such powerful ways, that he fought their battles for them, for the Israelites, and they won with God's help on the way to the promised land. Again, it'd be an interesting study to go look through all of those. But again, one of the more famous ones as they were coming was Jericho, where all they had to do was circle the city and, in a prescribed number of ways, over a prescribed number of days, and then blow the trumpets. And the walls came down, and they didn't have to, as it were, lift a hand against those people to defeat them. So God's might was made manifest in these things, and he was willing to fight their battles as long as they allowed them to. Verse 10 says, "The mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands high." So again, the overflowing of the water. So we start and we continue, and we're going to go throughout, more points of history. And this is his, I think, point. It's God's point, and it's also Habakkuk's point as well, as he is, I believe, under inspiration to say these things. Even in our prayers to God, God can inspire them. That it described the victory of Deborah, and Barak over Sisera, when a sudden rainstorm turned the battlefield into a swamp and left the enemy's chariots completely useless. I mean, it seems to be what it's pointing to, and it would fit also into the context of everything else that's going on here. Verse 11, again, now we're moving through other parts of the history of the Israelites. It says that the sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went, at the shining of your glittering spear. So when the sun and moon stood still, to me, immediately goes to the time when in Joshua 10, where the sun stood still, right? The armies of Israel had come against the forces of the Amorite kings, and Gibeon had routed them, beat them. And as the Amorites fled, I think God struck many of the soldiers with a large hailstone, and Joshua prayed at that time for the sun and moon to stand still so that they could pursue them and completely destroy the Amorite army. And God did this. However he did that, and we can all suppose things, and there can be all kinds of conspiracy theories surrounding it. It doesn't matter. God was able to do it by his sheer awesomeness and will, that he was, quote unquote, able to make the sun and moon stand still. And at the light of your arrows and the glittering of the spear could then be references to the fact that they didn't have to shoot in the dark and that the sun was still there. And you could see the reflection on these implements that were used to subdue the rest of the Amorite army. Verse 12 of Habakkuk 3 says, "You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger." So again, this is what we're talking about here, is that, it's God's judgment coming on the people, right? Even whether it's Judah or the Chaldeans or others in the past, God will judge these people for their sins. Now, the interesting thing, whenever I see the word indignation, I automatically think of the day of the Lord, right? And so we're seeing this symbolism. We're seeing it how it points to the time immediately after this prophecy was given to Habakkuk, whenever Judah was going to go into captivity with the Babylonian system, but also as well as the day of the Lord, which is coming in the future, which is then going to be God's time of wrath on the world. So you have the Great Tribulation, which God puts his people through to bring about change in them for the better. But then, and again, he uses or allows Satan to do that, to have his time against spiritual and physical Israel. And then there's shortly after that, that's the fifth seal. The seventh seal is called the day of the Lord and the day of his indignation. So in Zephaniah 3:8, again, we've been through that here in recent times. So I'll just say, read that one verse. It says, "Therefore wait for me, says the Lord, until the day I rise up for plunder. My determination is to gather the nations to my assembly of kingdoms, to pour on them my indignation, all my fierce anger. All of the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. So we see this then not only as something in the future, which is where my mind automatically goes as well, but in conjunction with verse 11, there's a duality to it, that he did march through the land in his indignation. And because of what God did, and God gave them the victory, the nations were trampled. And the victory was given to God's people and not against them. So once again, now you're going to have the people at this time of Habakkuk, the nation of Judah, having to kind of like shake their heads when they're hearing this and saying, yep, that's true once again. He's been doing it. He did it for, got us out of Egypt. He did it throughout the history. And look, he did a great work here. And again, it was nothing that mankind can do to stop the sun and the moon, but God did it, and he did it just for his people. So back to Habakkuk 3 and verse 13, where we now come to the end of the next little section where it ends with Selah. It says, "You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck." Selah. So God has done all of these things in order to save his people and fulfill prophecy. He is, he was, and he will be the salvation of his people. And that's the point that Habakkuk is kind of getting through, and God's trying to get through to Habakkuk, and he did, as well as the rest of the people in the time. But it goes on here and says, "For salvation with your anointed." Now, I think it's a little misleading here in the New King James Version because it has a capital A referring to Christ, who was the anointed one. But I think here, as many other translations have it, as well as the King James Version, is that it should be a little a. Now, it refers to here, and again, we're talking about the people that were being saved, again, by God, but they're being led by men. So people like Moses and Aaron and Joshua. And we see in the past as well that Moses and Aaron, actually both of them together, were a symbol of Christ, right? Christ has many roles, and he's so awesome that, you can divide it up, and it's enough for one man to try to symbolize it, Moses, and he was the leader, and he was the leader of the people. Then you had Aaron, who was now doing the more or less the religious part of it. And again, it's hard to separate some of these things, but he did it. And then you have Joshua, who was also a type of Christ, and even the name Joshua and Jesus are virtually the same thing. And he was a type of Christ because he led the people into the promised land, just as Christ will do in the future. And again, we had mentioned this before, like the second Exodus. So the people of Israel, and we did a message on this in terms of the coming captivity of the people of Israel. Again, you have to identify who Israel and Judah are today and see that they will go into captivity again as a means of correction. But then when he returns, he's going to lead them out, and it's going to be what I call the second Exodus, and it's going to make the first one pale in comparison, so much so that they won't even really refer to the first one anymore. So you can imagine them saying the Exodus, and it won't refer to the time when they came out of Egypt. That's hard to imagine, because that's exactly what we're going to remember, what we do remember, but it's going to be so awesome in its scope yet here in the future that's how it's going to be. It's going to make the previous one pale in comparison. So again, back to the verse here, the anointed, looks like it right here, it refers to the physical leaders at the time, the ones who were anointed to lead the people of God at that time. And again, they represented the anointed. So that's not that much of a stretch. And I think it's a correct translation to, again, there was no capitalization, but we put the capital A to represent things that are godly. But in this point, I think the smaller a is appropriate. So then it says, you struck the head from the house of the wicked. And for me, I immediately go to Genesis 3 and verse 15 in terms of the future and what's going to happen here. Because remember, we're talking about, something that the Feast of Trumpets represents in terms of the second Exodus, among, the return of Christ and other things. But then you have the Day of Atonement, which comes after, which represents the binding of Satan. And so in Genesis 3:15, it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. All right, so again, a reference to Christ and to Satan, that Christ would then, or that his, quote unquote, his heel would be bruised. So Christ would die. I mean, he came and died, but that was not the end. But then in the true end of Satan, again, the bruising his head, he would then be limited in terms of his influence on mankind by his binding up, and then we'd be able to usher in the millennium and the peace of God on humanity without having our adversary, our enemy, this beginning of liars and murderers who's trying to foist his ways on the whole world and deceive them there to influence us. So to me, it seems to follow here and is in line with these things. And even if it is just talking about, you struck the head from the house of the wicked, as being those who were their captors, so that was the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians came in and, as it were, released the Israelites to go back, as was prophesied as well. It can still be dual, and it still, I think, would have fit appropriately for both of them. So then verse 14 of Habakkuk 3, it says, you thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like the feasting on the poor in secret. So again, you have this imagery of the arrows and the head of his villages. So we were talking about the arrows before and the heads of the villages, the leaders of these governments, as it were, or peoples, however you want to symbolize it into, depending on the size of things. But they came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Again, seems to be allusion to the time of when the Persians conquered the Chaldeans as a historical fulfillment. But it's also something that we're going to see in the future as well. I mean, Psalm 110, verses 5 and 6. And Psalm 110 is what I call a messianic psalm. It talks heavily about Messiah, along with several other psalms. But it says in Psalm 110, verse 5, it says, the Lord is at your right hand. He shall execute kings in the day of his wrath. He shall judge among nations. He shall fill the places with dead bodies. He shall execute the heads of many countries. So again, we look at the historical fulfillment and this future fulfillment when Christ is going to return. And at the last trump, the kingdoms, there's going to be this these loud voices in heaven. And it's like, man, it kind of gives me chills to even think about that. It says the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and his Christ, and he's going to live and reign forever and ever. So we have this very specific line of demarcation when Satan's no longer going to be in charge of the world, right? Because again, the Bible talks about his throne, on here on earth. It talks about that in Revelation. And then also that he's the God of this world and of this age in Ephesians 2 and 2 Corinthians 4. And it's all the way, because Christ already qualified. He's just waiting for the Father to send him back to make it at this time. And then at this exact time that Revelation 11:15 talks about, this is what's going to happen. And Christ is coming back in power and might. He's not going to come as the sacrificial lamb who turned the other cheek, right? He's coming back in all power and authority. So again, at the time of Habakkuk, he says, okay, look, I'm going to free you from your captivity then, but we also know that it's going to happen in the future. And once again, we're looking at God's saving power in all of this. And this is what, if you want to call it the lesson, and part of the lessons that Habakkuk learned was that, okay, yeah, these things are going to happen. They're going to happen for a reason. And it's going to be by these people, but I'm going to deliver you in the future because I can. And when you stop and think about it and all the things that we've gone through here and the things that Habakkuk is bringing up, the things that have happened in the past, you're going, yeah, that's a good lesson for us, by way of reminding us the things that we already knew, but sometimes we kind of just need that little gentle kick. And we see, yes, okay, God can do these things and God will do these things. So back to Habakkuk 3 in verse 15, it says, you walked through the sea with your horses, through the heap of great waters. So the interesting thing here is that even when you don't see God doing it, God is doing things. He is actively and intimately involved in your lives. Now, the horses, right? Okay, we were going through Zechariah 1 verse 8, and we see that Christ rides a horse, and there's also other scriptures in, I think it's Revelation 18, where Christ is returning on a horse, and his saints are going to return on horses with him. But notice this in Psalm 77. Or have you turn to Psalm 77 verses 13 through 18. Again, the point I want to make is that it's common for Christ to be riding a horse, and for there to be horses. I mean, I think horses are mentioned some 10 times in Zechariah, and typically refer to his angels that he's using. And again, angels are servants of God that he uses for a whole bunch of particular things. But notice this in Psalm 77, verses 13 through 18, and it's in a reference to what was happening in the Red Sea at the time of the crossing of the Israelites when they were escaping out of Egypt, and he did the miracle of dividing the waters so that they could escape the Egyptians who were bearing down on them with one of the mightiest armies of all time. So in verse 13 of Psalm 77, your way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Who is so great a God as our God? So this is what's on Asaph's mind here, and he's the one I think that wrote this psalm, is, okay, God is great. You, verse 14, are the God who does wonders. You have declared your strength. Again, so we see this kind of similarity between what Habakkuk is recalling and what Asaph is talking about here. So you've declared your strength among the peoples. You have with your arm redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph, Selah. So again, he's, as it were, buying them back, saving them from their troubles, from their problems. Verse 16, the waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you, they were afraid. The depths also tremble. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. Your arrows also flashed about. Right? We were talking about that in verse 11, talking about his arrows. And I want to say that there was also another reference, I think, in verse 4 about the flashing about. But again, we're talking about, so the waters were afraid, they split. And verse 18, the voice of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up. Again, I think a reference back to chapter 3 and verse 4. You can kind of make these little parallels and see the commonality here. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. And now note verse 19. Your way was in the sea. You're passing the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. So this is what we're talking about in verse 15. Here is that God was there among them. Okay, if we put that together with Habakkuk, on the horses, and they were there, and they were not seen. And it reminds me also of, I think it was Elisha who was with his buddy there, and the buddy was afraid. And, Elisha said, show him. And he looked around, and the hills were such that, those who were with them were greater than those who were against them. And so there was this mighty army, and the people are traveling through without a clue that they were there with them. In verse 20, it says, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So once again, we go back to Habakkuk, and we're talking about, for salvation with your anointed, you went forth for the salvation of your people, all right, and for the salvation with your anointed. And here he is talking in Psalm 77 that, okay, yeah, they're being led by Moses and Aaron here. And then also, then we skip down to verse 15. It says, you walk through the sea with your horses, through the heap of great waters. And your way was in the sea, your path was in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. Again, we live in a physical world, and we cannot readily transverse into the spirit realm like they can our way. And they're all around us, whether it's a guardian angel or, bringing a message or, doing whatever, all the other things that the angels are known to do. So again, I find those things, okay, very interesting, but it's also should bring amount of solace to us and comfort, knowing, okay, that God is with us at these times. So during the times of trouble, God's going to be with us even when we don't see it, and he's going to be there in might and power. So back to Habakkuk 3 and verse 16, we see then, the effects of God doing these things, right? When we see here in verse 16, and Habakkuk says, when I heard, my body trembled, my lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. So what we see here is that even in this, as it were, the presence of God, and whenever you just think of the awesomeness of God, that it can almost be overwhelming, and we should, be in fear and reverence and tremble at the fact that God is doing these things. But that Habakkuk, then, he didn't have the concern that he had when the book started. So when the day of trouble comes, he is actually going to be able to rest, as it were, knowing that God is in charge and that he is working things out and that he is doing it justly. And this reference to day of trouble, again, we were talking about before, day of indignation, the day of the Lord, this day of trouble, again, refers to a future time as well. And typically, because we see this terminology throughout the Bible, typically we do look to the future. But here, in the case of Habakkuk, it also points to their time in captivity as well. But more specifically here, them coming out of it. There's going to be trouble for the Babylonians who took them into captivity. And so it's going to be a day of trouble for their captors, which would then allow them to be released and to no longer be enslaved. And so, again, we see that exact same thing happening in the future, as we already discussed, that Babylon, the whole Babylonian system, will ultimately fail in the day of the Lord. And again, this is this time at the return of Christ in the future, when he is coming back in power and authority. And he's coming back, again, I keep saying that. That's the way that most of the Jews and Israelites, I'll say the Jews more specifically, because it was manifest at the first coming of Christ with the scribes and the Pharisees and Sadducees and whatnot, that they looked at Christ and they thought he was coming back. Or he's coming, the first time, the only time, in this power and authority that would allow them to be freed out from under the world-ruling empires that they've been subjugated to for so long. They didn't realize it was a two-part coming, right? Zechariah 14, verse 3, again, would have been one of these things that a lot of them would have been looking to before Christ came the first time. And it says, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. So he's coming back. Again, we compare that to how he came the first time when I was describing him as the sacrificial lamb. And so here he's coming back in might and power. So again, it's this two-part coming to accomplish different things at different times. But the time that we're talking about, this is a day of salvation, right? Where he's going to release the people from captivity, as he's done in the past, and he's going to do for the physical, and it's going to be a day of salvation even spiritually for the people that he is calling at this point in time and has called in the past. Then we get to verse 17 of Habakkuk 3. It says, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. So again, times are looking really bad. The outlook is dire and dim here. These things are all going sideways. It doesn't look good. But, verse 18, he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. So we have this comparison and contrast just with Habakkuk, right? In terms of the way that he started, his perspective has completely changed. In fact, if you can just turn back a few pages to Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, you see, the way he started, he says, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There's strife and contention arises. Right? And he goes on to complain. He has no idea what's going on. He doesn't trust God to do, the things that God can do, to the point here where he's saying, okay, look, the outlook is not good at all. I mean, the trees are failing, our food source is gone. And, what are we going to do to live and to, make it to the next day? To verse 18, he goes, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. I mean, what a turnaround. He's saying, no matter what's going on here, okay, I'm going to have the right perspective. I'm going to be joyful and rejoice that God, and he calls him God of my salvation, he is the God who can have his back. He's the God who can save him. And he's going to focus on that. And the fact who God is, as he has been doing through this third chapter. And so now he has complete faith and trust in God, no matter what. So no matter what's going on around him, no matter how bad, he's going to what? Live by faith. And then verse 19, it says, the Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. So to the chief musician with my stringed instruments. So again, God is going to deliver. God will help him, help us to stand up and to be sure-footed in times of trouble. Again, this is the connotation of the deer's feet in the high hills, running through the hills, and perhaps they're steep, perhaps they're rocky, but God's going to be there. And so what we see then is that Habakkuk's interaction with God has produced faithfulness. He looked to God for the answers to for the deep and meaningful questions that he had, and he did not come up empty-handed. So, this is the lesson for us. We need to move forward. We need to continue to move forward in faith. So then finally here in verse 19, it says, "To the chief musician with my stringed instruments," which again leads us to the conclusion that, this was to be sung as a hymn or a psalm. And Habakkuk is giving him certain instructions or cues or directions of, how to set it to music. Now, as I started off by saying, we are at this parallel time in history, right? Basically, we're at the same time in history that Habakkuk was, with this impending captivity and the destruction of the nations and the tribes of, not just Judah, but Israel by the Babylonian system, right? So they had theirs then, and there's going to be one final one that's coming up in the future. What then are the lessons that we are to take from the book to help us, to guide us, to aid us in these tumultuous times that will soon be upon us? So I would just want to go through 7 quick points of things that, lessons that at least I derived from the book of Habakkuk. First is, we have a God that we can talk to. We just have to do it in the right way, right? Hebrews 4:15 and 16. We have Christ who came as a flesh and blood human being, and he can sympathize with our weaknesses. So he knows that we have frailties, and I think that he will even make allowances for certain of those. But in spite of all that, he says, come boldly to the throne of grace. Okay, so come in the right attitude, though, and you will obtain mercy. You'll find grace, especially in your time of need. So we're not to make accusations. We're always to remember who God is, what he is. And even to a certain degree, Habakkuk's complaining, just rubbed me the wrong way. Again, we should be thankful. We should be understanding. And perhaps we now have this lesson in hindsight. Now that we know it, now we're accountable for it. Just go and ask him in the right way. Point number 2, God has a plan, right? This plan has been in the works since before the creation of the physical universe, right? And it's still now being played out just as God has laid it out between him and the Son. So every nation right now and everything that's going on is exactly where it's to be at the point in time that it's supposed to be, right? There is nothing that's going on that is outside the scope and the plan of God. And it's going to happen when it's supposed to happen, right? Habakkuk 2 and verse 3, he says, "For the vision is yet for an appointed time," right? So God's saying, look, I've got this. I'm going to do this when it's time to do it and in the way that it's to do it. So you don't have to fret about what's happening to you and your people or what's happening to other people in the world. God gave us, the revelation, and these things here, even in the book of Habakkuk, was for a future time. And he's bringing those things about. Point number 3 is God is control. This goes hand in hand with God, has a plan because he's ultimately controlling everything. Things don't always appear as they seem. Don't seem as they appear. It seems that this astute military prowess of the Chaldeans, that they had achieved their ascendancy to power in and of themselves. Well, it just happened to be at the right time, and then God's using them as a means of punishing Judah. That didn't just happen, by fiat. God is in control and he's bringing these things about. God has a very active part in our lives, whether we understand that or see that. I know the world doesn't. The world sees him as a hands-off God that's allowing, Satan to win, as it were. The reality is, the more that we understand and know what the Bible has to say, the more you're going to see God's hand at work, and that he is working very intimately and personally in your life, as well as the world as a whole, and he's orchestrating prophecy and all that that means for the future. So what's going on right now is not time and chance. Habakkuk 1, verses 5 through 6, he says, look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded. Again, we can, because God is orchestrating and he is controlling the things that he has a plan for. Point number 4. We can get the answers to the deeper questions. Like, why does God allow bad things to happen? What was God doing with Judah? Judah had problems that need to be corrected, right? The Chaldeans. And then the punishments for each were different, as he has different purposes at different times. And so we begin to see then that God is not hands off. So the question is, why does he allow bad things to happen? Well, we understand now more so in just these examples. We see that when Christians have trials versus the tribulation that the rest of the world goes through, that while sometimes it can be the same exact thing, they're for different reasons. And we can now understand what that is. But again, we have to go back to the Bible. We have to study and pray, beseech God for these types of answers. And once we start looking more deeply into them, then we start looking at the world news and we can interpret it better in the light of prophecy. Right? Again, these are the deeper things. These are things that are still to happen, things that we have been given the opportunity to understand. And we answered the questions based on what God has said in his word, what he said he's going to do. So again, we have to study, and we have to then filter these things through the word of God, which is truth. Everybody else has their form of truth, their idea of truth, but it's not going to lead to the right answers, or especially the deeper questions. Point number 5, God can use anyone to fulfill his purposes. And this is what we also need to understand. Whether it's somebody right around you or it's a nation overseas, we saw the image of Daniel, and it told of all the world ruling empires. So God's going to use these Gentile nations, and he named them ahead of time. And sure enough, it all came to fruition. But he brought them about and set them up. He can even use Balaam's donkey. He can do this and even more. So, yes, to answer Habakkuk's question, he can use the Chaldeans, who are even worse than the people of Judah, to accomplish his purpose, and then accomplish other purposes with the Chaldeans and the world-ruling empires. So again, we need to be cognizant and aware that we need to be focused on what it is that we're to be doing and what the truth is, and then perhaps, through our studies, that we come to understand how he's using other things, other people's, other events to fulfill his purposes. Point number 6, there will be a day of reckoning. So, we reap what we sow. Numbers 32:23 says, your sin will find you out. So there's going to be an answer, whether it's Judah doing wrong or the Chaldeans doing wrong or us personally doing what's wrong or anybody else in the world doing what's wrong. There's a great tribulation that's coming to straighten out a lot of the people of physical Israel as well as spiritual Israel. And then there's the day of the Lord coming on the rest of the world. And again, there's going to be a day of reckoning. Now, let me just throw this in as well. Again, this is the main point of the Bible. We can have comfort in knowing that if we repent, we can be forgiven. Of course, if you repent sincerely and genuinely, and then if we continue to obey, then we can avoid certain corrections in the future. That's why God punishes, is he wants to affect change in the lives of people. If we give ourselves to God, submit to God, open our heart to be corrected, to be understood, to understand what the Bible has to say, we can get ahead of that curve. And we can avoid a lot of problems, that's for sure. And then finally, point number 7 is simply, God is awesome. He's to be revered. In all of this, we see the greatness of God and how high his ways are above ours. When we think, with our limited ability in our mind, that this is, again, we tend to be focused on one single thing that's happening, and God's got a multitude of things going on at the same exact time. And so, again, do not limit God. We might not understand everything that's going on and what he's doing and how he's bringing everything about. But, and then here's the final word from Habakkuk, is that in all of this, no matter what, we should continue to live by faith in God.